1,000 years ago, the largest city on Earth wasn't in China. It wasn't in the Middle East. It was in the jungles of Southeast Asia. 1 million people sustained by a water management system more sophisticated than anything Europe would build for centuries. The Khmer Empire didn't conquer its neighbors with armies alone. It conquered them with water, canals, reservoirs, rice fields that produced a staggering agricultural surplus, enough to feed a metropolis and fund the greatest temple complex ever built. This is the story of Angkor, how water built the world's largest pre-industrial city, and how the monsoon which gave it life eventually took it all away. I'm your host, and this is Empires and Economics. To understand Angkor, start with geography. The empire's heartland sat on a flat alluvial plain north of the Great Tonle Sap Lake, a lake that performs one of the most dramatic natural tricks on Earth. Every year, the monsoon swells the Mekong River. The river backs up, and instead of flowing out to sea, it flows backward, into the Tonle Sap, expanding the lake from about 2,500 square kilometers to over 15,000. The plain is flooded, fertilized, and renewed. The Khmer kings looked at this yearly flood and saw not chaos, but opportunity. If they could capture the water, store it, and release it on command, they could grow rice on a scale no one had ever attempted. So they built a hydraulic machine the size of a kingdom. By the 12th century, the Khmer had transformed the landscape around Angkor into a water network of more than 1,000 kilometers of canals, embankments, and reservoirs, the largest engineered water system in the pre-industrial world. The centerpieces of this system were the baray, enormous rectangular reservoirs, some so large they can still be seen from space. The West Baray, built in the 11th century, is 8 kilometers long and more than 2 kilometers wide. It holds roughly 50 million cubic meters of water. It was dug entirely by hand, with the excavated earth piled into banks that still stand 5 meters high. Consider what that required. No wheeled vehicles, no iron tools in quantity, just hundreds of thousands of laborers, organized over decades, moving earth basket by basket under a tropical sun. The baray were not just storage tanks. They were the economic engine of the empire. They captured the monsoon rains and the floodwaters of the Tonle Sap. Then, in the dry season, that water was released through sluice gates into a grid of canals, feeding rice fields across the plain. The result was a controlled water supply that allowed 2, sometimes 3 rice harvests a year in a region where a single annual harvest was the norm. Rice was the currency of the Khmer Empire, and the water system multiplied its production. The Khmer developed a rice variety suited to the region, deep water rice that could survive the annual floods, planted as the waters rose and harvested as they receded. Alongside it, the irrigated fields fed by the canals produced dry season crops that other societies simply did not have. The surplus was staggering. Angkor fed a population estimated at 750,000 to 1 million people in the city itself, with millions more across the empire's provinces. And surplus is the foundation of everything. The kings taxed that surplus in the form of rice. They stored it in granaries, and they spent it on armies, on administrators, and on the most spectacular building program the ancient world had ever seen. The water didn't just feed the people, it paid for the temples. Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century by King Suryavarman II, is the largest religious monument in the world. It covers over 160 hectares. Its central tower rises 65 meters. The stone used to build it, more than 5 million tons of sandstone, was quarried 40 kilometers away and floated down the canals on rafts. Think about that supply chain. Every block of stone traveled from the quarry to the site by water. Water that existed because the kings had built the canals. The temple economy ran on the same infrastructure as the rice economy. The sandstone blocks were cut, dressed, and fitted with a precision that still astonishes engineers. The walls are covered in bas reliefs stretching for more than a kilometer, battle scenes, processions, and cosmological imagery carved in exquisite detail. Angkor was not one city but many, a sprawling low-density metropolis of temples, reservoirs, and village clusters spread over 1,000 square kilometers. At its center, kings built and rebuilt the state temple of the Bayon, with its serene stone faces, the walled city of Angkor Thom, the terraces and processional ways. Each great king sought to outbuild his predecessor. That required labor, and the labor was paid in effect in rice and water rights. The kings granted land, canals, and harvests to temples and officials in exchange for service. The temples themselves became economic institutions, owning land, storing grain, managing workforces, and acting as the banks and granaries of the empire. The Chinese envoy Zhou Daguan, who visited Angkor in the late 13th century, recorded a kingdom of astonishing wealth, gold vessels, silk clothing, and a king who processed through the streets under multiple parasols. What he couldn't see from the palace was the invisible machinery, the water system that made it all possible. The canals were the highways of Angkor. The empire moved rice, stone, and goods by water, the cheapest way to move anything before the age of railways. The system connected the temples, the rice fields, and the Great Lake. Fishing villages on the Tonle Sap supplied protein to the capital. The lake's fisheries were, and still are, among the richest in the world. Trade flowed too. The Khmer exported rice and forest products, spices, resins, aromatic woods, to China and to the ports of the Malay Peninsula and India. In return came ceramics, glass, textiles, and silver. The Chinese court received tribute from Angkor and sent gifts back. The relationship was as much commercial as diplomatic. The scale of the water economy is what makes Angkor unique. Archaeologists using LiDAR, laser mapping from aircraft, have revealed an entire engineered landscape hidden beneath the jungle, field systems, canals, and roads radiating across the plain. What looked like an abandoned city in the forest was, in its time, an industrial-scale agricultural machine. And the Khmer understood that water was power. Royal inscriptions record kings digging reservoirs, straightening rivers, and dedicating waterworks to the gods. The king was, in a very real sense, the manager of the monsoon. Modern researchers have estimated the carrying capacity of the system with remarkable precision. The canals and reservoirs could store enough water to irrigate the plain through the dry season, while the annual flood renewed the soil. The surplus generated by this system funded one of the longest-lived empires in Southeast Asian history, over 600 years of continuous rule. But the same system that created the empire contained the seeds of its fragility. The water system worked for centuries. Then, in the 14th and 15th centuries, it began to fail. Tree ring and sediment studies have revealed what happened. A series of severe droughts, punctuated by violent monsoon floods. The climate swung between extremes, years of famine, followed by years of destructive downpours. The hydraulic machine was built for a predictable monsoon. When the rains failed, the reservoirs ran low, the canals ran dry, and the rice harvest collapsed. When the rains returned with force, the flood control structures, neglected and silted up, could not cope. The canals overflowed. The banks broke. A system that required constant maintenance at massive scale became a liability. When the water stopped working, the king lost the one thing that justified his power, the ability to feed the city. By the 15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned. The court moved south, toward Phnom Penh and the river trade routes. The jungle moved back in, swallowing the temples and the canals. The old explanation was invasion, the Siamese armies sacking the city. But the archaeological evidence points to a slower, deeper tragedy, the economic collapse of the water system itself. Invasions were a symptom, not the cause. The real killer was climate and the failure of an infrastructure that could not adapt. The lesson of Angkor is one of the great cautionary tales of economic history. Water made Angkor possible. Water sustained it for 600 years. And when the monsoon became unpredictable, the entire edifice, the temples, the kings, the million people, dissolved, because the economy had been built on a single, fragile foundation, a water supply that the climate no longer delivered. But Angkor's water system did not die completely. The descendants of its builders still farm the same plain. The West Baray still holds water. Modern Cambodia has re-engineered parts of the ancient network, and researchers study Angkor's canals as a model for sustainable water management in a changing climate. The Khmer built the largest pre-industrial city in the world on a foundation of water. They showed that infrastructure is the most powerful economic force a society can create and the most fragile. The water built the city. The water fed the million. And when the water failed, the city dissolved into the jungle it had been carved from. The towers still stand, the canals still run, and the question Angkor leaves us is simple. What are we building that depends on a resource we take for granted, and what happens when it runs out? The greatest engineering achievement of the medieval world was not a wall or a cathedral. It was water, moved by hand and by gravity, feeding the city of a million souls.